take a second, like right now, and just look around the room you're sitting in. Look at your phone, look at the shoes in your closet, maybe the computer screen you use every single day. Chances are half the things you are looking at have this tiny little label on them that says, Made in China.
Yeah, it's literally everywhere. It's so ubiquitous that we don't even think about it anymore.
Right. It just feels like a law of nature at this point. But there is a really fascinating historical paradox hidden in that little label. Because over 200 years ago, Napoleon Bonaparte supposedly warned the world about this exact scenario.
Oh yeah, he allegedly said, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world."
Exactly. And that quote is the core mystery we are unpacking for you in today's deep dive. Because for a very long time, China really did seem to be asleep economically. I mean, we are talking about a country that up until the late 1970s was largely isolated from global trade. It was struggling with just unimaginable widespread poverty.
Welcome to the Missing Lessons, where we explain what school never did.
And understanding this transformation, it isn't just about knowing geography or history. Understanding China is basically the ultimate cheat code to understanding the modern global economy, right? It explains the tech in your hands, the job market you're entering, and the geopolitical shifts that are going to define the rest of your life.
If you're enjoying the Missing Lessons, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating, and share it with someone who might find it interesting. It helps us create more episodes and reach more curious minds.
So to understand the sheer explosion of the Chinese economy, like how they became this global manufacturing superpower in less than a single lifetime, you first have to understand the absolute devastation they were recovering from. I have to rewind a bit, back to the era before 1979.
Right, because back then, China was operating under a strictly centrally controlled command economy.
Right, and command economy is one of those dry terms that gets thrown around in history classes, but what does that actually look like on the ground for a regular person, like if you were living there?
It means the state directs virtually every single economic interaction. There are no price tags driven by supply and demand like we're used to.
So the government just decides what gets built, how much it costs, and who gets to buy it.
Exactly. You have bureaucrats in the capital trying to predict exactly how many tons of wheat the whole country will need, how many bicycles, how many pairs of shoes, and then they issue these strict production quotas to factories and farms.
Which is wild because private businesses were entirely banned. You couldn't just open a shop. You didn't even use cash to buy food. You used these state-issued ration coupons.
Which sounds like an absolute administrative nightmare, honestly.
It totally is, because if I want to invent a new product, or, I don't know, if a factory figures out a faster way to make shoes, there's zero incentive to do so. The state just takes whatever extra you make.
There's no reward for innovation, and there's no mechanism to signal what people actually need.
Exactly. So if the bureaucrats guess wrong, you end up with a massive warehouse full of shoes that nobody wants, and then a totally empty warehouse where the winter coats are supposed to be.
Wow, yeah.
And the human cost of attempting to force this system to rapidly industrialize was just staggering. In the late 1950s, the leadership under Mao Zedong launched this massive campaign called the Great Leap Forward.
The goal was to rapidly industrialize the countryside almost overnight, right?
Yeah, but the way they went about it is almost incomprehensible when you look back at it now. The leadership wanted to overtake the UK and the US in steel production, but they didn't have the modern industrial infrastructure to actually do that.
So what did they do?
Well, their solution was to force rural farmers into these massive communes and order them to build makeshift backyard furnaces. Local officials were terrified of failing to meet these impossible quotas set by the central government.
So they just forced peasants to make steel.
Yeah, they forced them to literally melt down their own pots, pans, and even their essential farming tools just to produce steel for the state.
Wait, but you can't make industrial-grade steel with, like, wood fires in a backyard.
Exactly, you can't. You just end up with this brittle, completely useless pig iron. And worse than that, while millions of farmers were ordered to spend all day melting down their tools, no one was actually tending to the crops.
Oh, no. So the food just stopped?
The crops were just left to rot in the fields. And because the local officials were terrified, they were lying to the central government, claiming they had these record harvests to make themselves look good.
So the state thought everything was fine.
Worse, the state actually exported grain to other countries while the villages were starving. It triggered a devastating, entirely man-made famine that killed roughly 20 million people.
It is so hard to even wrap your head around a number like 20 million.
It really is. And yet, the chaos didn't even stop there. Because less than a decade later, in the 1960s, a new movement was launched called the Cultural Revolution.
Which was basically a massive political purge disguised as a cultural movement, right?
Spot on. The goal was to rid the country of anything deemed capitalist, traditional, or foreign. They mobilized this militarized youth movement called the Red Guard, and their job was to destroy what they called the Four Olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas.
So they were destroying ancient temples and burning classical literature.
Yeah, and they publicly humiliated or even killed teachers, intellectuals, and anyone accused of having ties to the West or just the old ways of doing things.
Okay, so standing in the wreckage of all that in the late 1970s, you have a traumatized population, an economy in complete ruins, and an entire generation whose education was derailed. How do you even begin to fix that? Like, what actually flipped the switch?
The pivot finally happened in 1979 under a leader named Deng Xiaoping. He looked at this dire situation and realized that for the country and, the ruling party to survive, it had to open up.
Right, he had this incredibly pragmatic approach.
Very pragmatic. He has this famous quote that really captures it. He said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice."
Meaning, who cares if a specific policy looks capitalist or communist on paper, as long as it actually grows the economy and feeds people?
Exactly. But the tricky part is, how do you inject capitalism into a staunchly communist system without the whole government collapsing?
You have to do it gradually, right?
Right. Through a system they called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the central mechanism for this was something called dual-track pricing. They didn't just abolish the state quotas overnight.
That would have been too shocking to the system.
Yeah, it would have been chaos. Instead, they told farmers, hey, you still have to give the state your required quota of grain at the fixed price. But if you work hard and grow extra grain beyond that quota, you can sell that surplus on the open market for whatever price people are willing to pay.
That is actually brilliant, because it satisfies the state's need for control, but suddenly gives the individual farmer a massive incentive to innovate and work harder.
Exactly. It unleashed this huge wave of agricultural productivity. But the real game changer, the mechanism that actually turned China into the world's factory, was the creation of special economic zones along the southern coast, in places like Shenzhen.
It kind of sounds like they essentially built capitalist quarantine zones.
That is a really, really accurate way to look at it. The leadership was terrified that Western democratic ideals would, infect the broader country if they just threw open the borders.
But they contained it.
Yeah, they drew lines around a few sleepy fishing villages on the coast and said, inside these zones, the old rules do not apply. The government offered massive tax breaks, eliminated all the usual bureaucratic red tape, and offered foreign corporations access to an incredibly cheap, vast labor force.
And obviously, the world's corporations just flooded in.
Oh, totally. If you are an American or European electronics company and you're looking to cut your manufacturing costs, this was just an unprecedented opportunity. And the stats on what happened next are honestly staggering.
Like world record breaking, right?
Yeah. For nearly 40 years, China saw an average annual GDP growth of 9.5%. They're basically doubling the size of their entire economy every 8 years.
Wow. And that boom lifted an estimated 800 million people out of poverty.
Yeah. It's widely considered the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. But, and this is a big but, we have to look at the mechanics of this boom, because it wasn't just a sudden total embrace of the free market.
I'm actually hung up on that. We hear all this talk about free market success and foreign investment, but the Chinese government is famously still deeply involved in running the economy. How do those two things even coexist?
That is the great paradox of the Chinese model. It is a heavily, heavily managed boom. While private, often foreign-owned companies were allowed to make consumer electronics and sneakers in those coastal zones, the state kept an iron grip on the foundational sectors of the economy.
Right, through state-owned enterprises, or SOEs.
Exactly. The government essentially monopolized the banking system, the oil and mining industries, and the telecom networks.
So how does the state fund these massive state-owned enterprises if they're supposedly allowing a private market to flourish?
Through a sneaky mechanism called financial repression. See, in the West, if you save money, you can invest it in stocks, bonds, international funds, or even just high-yield savings accounts, right?
Yeah, you have options to grow your money.
But in China, especially during the boom, the government strictly limited where average citizens could put their money. Capital controls prevented them from moving money out of the country. So regular citizens put their massive savings into state-run banks.
And those banks probably weren't paying great interest.
Exactly. The state banks paid the citizens artificially low interest rates. Then the banks turned around and lent that exact same money at incredibly cheap rates to the state-owned enterprises.
Ah, so they used the citizens' savings to build massive infrastructure projects, bridges, high-speed rail, whole new cities.
You got it. It's almost like a hidden tax on the average saver's bank account to fund these huge state projects. Which leads me to a major contradiction here. Well, if they lifted 800 million people out of poverty, why does the wealth inequality in the country look so extreme today? Like, if you put yourself in the shoes of a young worker living through this hypergrowth, what did this actually look like on the ground?
This brings us to one of the most hidden mechanisms of this economic miracle, right? The hukou system.
Yes, the hukou system. It's a household registration system that actually dates back to the old command economy era. It legally ties your socioeconomic benefits, so things like healthcare, pensions, education, to the specific town or rural village where you were born.
Okay, so when those special economic zones opened up and over 100 million people migrated from poor rural areas to the coastal cities to find factory work, they had to bring their rural hukou status with them.
Exactly. They're the ones building the glittering skyscrapers in Shanghai. They're the ones assembling the smartphones in Shenzhen. But because their hukou is registered in some rural village miles away, they're not legally considered residents of the gay cities they're literally building.
So it's like having a VIP wristband to a luxury music festival, but you're only allowed to clean the venue, you can't watch the concert, and you can't even use the bathrooms.
That is a perfect analogy. Because of that hukou status, these migrant workers are denied basic city benefits. They don't get access to the city's medical insurance, they get no pensions, and crucially, they can't even send their kids to the local public schools.
That is heartbreaking. They are treated almost like undocumented immigrants inside their own country.
They form this massive, exploitable underclass. They have to save huge amounts of their already meager factory wages just to survive and pay out of pocket for basic services. Or they have to leave their children behind in the rural villages with their grandparents.
So it's a massive human cost for all those cheap global electronics we buy.
A massive human cost. And, the physical environment took just as much of a beating.
Yeah, I think anyone who follows the news has seen the pictures of the smog over there.
Oh, for sure. There were days in major cities where the air pollution was so thick and toxic they literally called it the airpocalypse.
But the mechanism behind that pollution wasn't just, normal industrialization, right? It was about the incentive structure for local government officials.
Right. For decades, a mayor or a provincial governor in China was evaluated and promoted by the central government based on one primary metric: GDP growth.
Basically, make the economy bigger at all costs.
Exactly. If you hit your economic growth targets, you got promoted. If you missed them, your career was totally over. So local officials routinely ignored environmental regulations. They looked the other way when chemical plants dumped toxic waste into rivers, and they greenlit heavily polluting coal plants just because it boosted their local GDP numbers.
And the result is that the air quality index would go beyond index, literally worse than the scale was even designed to measure.
Yeah, and an estimated 90% of Chinese cities have polluted groundwater. So this economic engine they built generated unprecedented wealth, but it's severely, severely overheated.
So what happens when that cheap labor pool starts to dry up and the environmental costs just become too much to ignore?
Well, the modern leadership is actually acutely aware of these limitations, recognizing these massive internal costs and facing a natural slowdown in growth, what they now call the new normal. China's leadership, under Xi Jinping, realized they had to shift strategies entirely.
Because they couldn't just rely on making cheap plastic toys forever.
Right, and this is where we start hearing about the Made in China 2025 initiative.
That's their comprehensive state-led plan to move the entire economy up the value chain.
Exactly. They realized that the real money and the real global power isn't in assembling the physical plastic parts of a smartphone. The power is in designing the microchips and writing the software.
So they want to dominate the core technologies of the future, like artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, aerospace, and green energy, like solar panels and EV batteries.
Exactly. And to secure the global trade routes, the natural resources, and the export markets for all this new high-tech manufacturing, they launched something called the Belt and Road Initiative.
The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, it is arguably the largest infrastructure project in human history.
It really is. It's this grand strategy where Chinese state banks offer massive loans to developing nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia to build ports, railways, and highways.
And they usually utilize Chinese construction firms and Chinese steel to actually do the building, right?
Yep. But wait, I need to push back on the overarching narrative here for a second, because from the outside looking in, especially from the West, this highly coordinated, push-dominating AI, buying up global ports, expanding into Africa, it looks like a super aggressive, confident attempt to basically take over the world.
It definitely looks like that on the surface.
But earlier, we talked about how their history of chaos makes them fearful. How does a deep fear of internal collapse square with aggressively opening their borders to all these global infrastructure projects?
Well, to understand their motives, you have to look at how the Chinese leadership views their own history, specifically what they call the century of humiliation.
Right, starting with the Opium Wars in the 1800s.
Exactly. Western powers forced open their ports, carved up the country, and China suffered massive internal rebellions and foreign occupation. They were essentially broken. So the deepest, most existential fear of the ruling party today is not an external invasion from the United States.
It's internal collapse.
Yes, it is internal collapse and chaos.
So you're saying all this outward economic expansion and the massive techno-surveillance state they've built internally is actually driven by vulnerability.
It is largely a defensive mechanism. Think about the facial recognition everywhere, the tracking of internet activity, the algorithmic social credit systems. They are designed to detect and extinguish any tiny spark of democratic revolution from below.
They want to put out the fire long before it becomes a threat to the state's survival.
Exactly. And externally, by exporting their infrastructure and their techno-authoritarian model through the Belt and Road Initiative, they are essentially building a global buffer zone.
Because if the developing world relies heavily on Chinese loans and Chinese tech, they are not going to criticize China's internal human rights record.
Right. They are trying to make the world safe for their specific style of autocratic government.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question for you, the listener. Taking all of this into account, the shift from backyard steel furnaces to artificial intelligence, the surveillance state, the global infrastructure loans, will China inevitably just take over the U.S. as the singular global superpower?
Well, the short answer is not necessarily, because they are currently flying into some massive historic headwinds.
Right. And the first one is this well-documented economic phenomenon called the middle income trap.
Right. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this trap. Is it essentially what happens when a country loses its competitive edge in cheap manufacturing but hasn't quite caught up to the advanced economies and high-tech innovation?
That is the exact squeeze. As your economy grows, your workers naturally demand higher wages and a better standard of living. Suddenly, you aren't the cheapest place to build a factory anymore.
So foreign companies start moving their supply chains to places like Vietnam, India, or Mexico.
Exactly. But at the same time, transitioning a massive economy to run on pure, high-end innovation, competing with the US, Japan, and Germany on cutting-edge microchips, is incredibly difficult. So you get stuck in the middle.
Wow. But an even bigger headwind than the middle income trap has to be their demographic crisis, right?
Oh, absolutely. For decades, they brutally enforced the one-child policy to curb population growth.
And the delayed mathematical effect of that policy is now hitting them with full force.
Yeah. A lot of people don't know this, but China's working age population actually peaked way back in 2011. It is now rapidly shrinking, while their elderly population is absolutely booming. Demographers call it the 4-2-1 problem.
So that's 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child.
Precisely. You have a single child who enters the workforce, and they are eventually responsible for supporting 2 aging parents and 4 aging grandparents without a strong state social safety net to actually help them.
It is a terrifying math problem for an economy.
It really is. You have fewer young, productive workers generating tax revenue and wealth, trying to support a massive, rapidly growing population of retirees.
And furthermore, even if China's total overall GDP eventually passes the United States in sheer size, we have to look at the per capita numbers.
Right. They have over 1.4 billion people. That means their wealth per person remains only a fraction of America's.
Which fundamentally limits their ability to project military and economic power globally over the long term, because the state still has hundreds of millions of its own citizens who are demanding basic services and higher living standards at home.
Exactly. So how do you, the listener, actually apply this understanding. The world is incredibly complex, but knowing the mechanisms behind China's rise gives you a lens to decode the future.
So what is the practical takeaway here?
The takeaway is you need to become a critical thinker about the global landscape. When you are looking at global supply chains breaking down, or when you are choosing a career path in tech or manufacturing, thinking about investments, or just trying to understand why a pair of shoes costs what it does, understand that global economics is heavily tied to deep historical geopolitics.
Right. Don't fall for simple us versus them narratives.
Exactly. If you understand why a country acts the way it does based on its traumas, its internal vulnerabilities, and the specific mechanisms of its economy, you stop being purely reactive. You become a sharper voter, a smarter consumer, and a much more strategic professional, because you can actually see the chess moves happening before they make the evening news.
China's modern history is a masterclass in how a nation can totally reinvent itself. By blending strict state control with the raw power of market incentives, they accomplish the greatest poverty alleviation in human history.
But it also serves as a really stark cautionary tale about the hidden, devastating long-term costs of hypergrowth at any expense.
Here's a question for you. Between the aging population, environmental challenges, and the push for technological dominance, which factor do you think will impact China's future the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.
As China attempts to export its model of techno-authoritarianism around the globe, the real battle of the 21st century might not be fought with aircraft carriers. It will likely be fought with competing systems of how human society should fundamentally be organized. Next time you pick up your phone or put on your shoes, just think about the immense complex machine that brought it to you. That tiny label tells a much bigger story than just where something was made. It tells the story of how the world is being reshaped right beneath our feet.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Missing Lessons, don't forget to follow the podcast, leave a rating, and share it with a friend. Your support helps us continue exploring the topics school never taught us.